Right, can everybody see that?
Yes.
We can see your notes. Okay,
Excellent.
yep, just the screen now.
Right, well, in that case, I will just...
No, we can just see the screen now, so it's good.
Brilliant. Right, so thank you for inviting me this evening, and I've got a fair bit to go through, but if we start running short on time, I'll hurry up. But I'm hoping you'll find it interesting. So I'm going to talk a little bit about nutrition broadly, and what it means for bees, and also just a little bit about how it's linked to the declining bees globally, and of course here in Australia as well. And then I'll talk a little bit about the recent paper that I worked on the nutrition of larval bees, and we'll finish off with a little bit of what that might mean in the context of you and me, and sort of focusing on what you can do a little bit at home to help with that. So I want to start with a quote, as I don't usually do, but it's a really good one, and it really sums up nutrition, I think, in terms of how much bigger and how much more important it is than perhaps we really realise. So nutrition touches, links and shapes all aspects of the biological world. It builds the components of organisms, and it fuels the dynamic interactions between these components. It determines whether or not wild animals thrive, how their populations grow, decline and evolve, and how assemblages of interacting species and ecosystems are structured. In short, nutrients are the interconnecting threads in the web of life. And that's a beautiful quote. It's from Stephen Simpson and David Raubenheimer, who actually work at Sydney University now, from their book, Nature of Nutrition. And it really captures how nutrition is linked to pretty much everything. Everything any animal does, including us, has got either nutrition directly or indirectly involved in what it does. And that's really important, because we often just think of nutrition as you know, what you get out of the fridge, but actually it's a lot deeper than that. So on that aspect, you can see I put those pictures in there because it's often what we think about when we hear the word nutrition. You know, things like food pyramids, or you know, supplements in the chemist, or that type of thing. But actually, it really extends well beyond that, and it affects everything in the biological world. But also for us in human beings, it's political, it's economical, and it's cultural as well. It really does play a huge role in everything that we do. And so today I'm going to focus on the macronutrients, which the primary three being protein, carbohydrate, and lipids. Obviously, it's a lot more complicated than that, and there's hundreds of micronutrients that can be involved as well. But we're just going to focus on those three today. And the overarching theme is that, you know, all organisms, including us, face the challenge of obtaining nutrients, and almost everything in animals' lives is either driven by the need to obtain them or the need to use them. So nutrition in bees. So we'll start with the obvious one, which is pollen and nectar. And I'm going to focus on those two because although there's a few little bits in between, they're the major components. So nectar is probably what we most associate with bees and their nutrition, and it's what we think of them as eating. And indeed, it is the primary source of carbohydrates for them. And in fact, most bees get their water from there as well. So I get a lot of questions about people who keep native bees saying, oh, you know, should we put water out for them? You don't really need to. The vast majority of bees get their water from their nectar. They don't necessarily drink. Now, nectar is essentially sugar. And those simple carbohydrates are what fuel the really energetic process of flight. I mean, the vast majority of a bee's thorax are its flight muscles, and it takes a lot of energy to produce that phenomenon of flight. And so they rely on that carbohydrate source. And of course, in social species as well, it forms the basis of honey. But for the vast majority of bees, honey is not really a significant part of their nutrition. It's yes, they do modify the nectar they receive, but they don't make honey in the way that we think of it, like the honeybee does, or as stingless bees do. So pollen's actually probably the less thought of the nutrient components that bees consume, but arguably it's the most important and actually the most challenging of foodstuffs to gather. So it forms the bulk of the protein and the fats that bees require, and especially at the larval stage, it's very, very important. But unlike nectar, which is its only job is a floral reward for pollinators, pollen isn't. Pollen is the reproductive gametes of the flowers. And so having a bee actually take that away from a flower, it costs that flower, it costs that plant. So there's actually a little bit of conflict that goes on there. And so pollen can contain more than just the nutrients the bees require. It can have defensive phytochemicals inside that in certain levels can be toxic. And in fact, many bees can only feed on certain pollens, and not all bees feed on the same ones. So I'll put a little picture there of a catkin just to highlight the sort of the complexity of that, because some flowers or some plants are not insect pollinated or animal pollinated at all. They rely on abiotic factors to pollinate them, like the wind. Yet many bees will still forage from wind pollinated plants. So there's no mutualism going on there because the plant doesn't require the insect, but the insect is still gathering that pollen. So it shows that there's a little bit more complicated than flowers and bees being friends. So I want to look at the two different sort of major stages that bees go through. And of course, that's going to be the adult that we're all familiar with, the ones we see in our gardens, but the larva as well. So adults' primary source of food tends to be nectar. So the adults have the majority of their life, they feed off nectar. I'll put a little asterisk against that because they do consume small amounts of pollen. It can be important for certain bees in terms of ovarian maturation, so the fact that they can produce eggs. But primarily nectar is their major food source. And of course, adult bees, they don't grow. So they've done all their growth and their change at the larval stage. And what they're all really doing is just maintaining themselves. They're just getting enough energy to fly around and do their job, which is to provide for their young. And that is their primary job. So the only real existence for a female bee is to reproduce and to raise her offspring. And the male bee is basically just a flying bag of sperm, and that's his only real job. So the larval stage, the unseen stage, the sort of the thing that we don't necessarily associate with bees is the time of great change. It's where all the growth occurs. It's where metamorphosis happens, and it is the critical part of a bee's development. So there's these pictures here on your right screen there. That's just a little picture of a Phyta resin bee larva. And on the left-hand side, those are pictures from the experiments that I did with the solitary bees in Europe. So you can see they're uniformly a maggot, essentially, and they don't really move a lot. All they do is sit and eat and defecate. That's pretty much it. And so all they do is they eat all that and they grow and they metamorphose. Now, for many solitary bees, in particular, nectar doesn't form a huge component of their larval diet. So the adults use it to sort of stick together a lot of the pollen to make a sort of mass, but it doesn't form a huge component. That can vary quite a lot between bee species. So some bee species, it's almost like a slurry, so there's a much higher content of nectar. And other ones, it's almost bone dry. So there are differences in what different bee species do for their larvae. But importantly as well, not all of the pollens are alike. So pollen, it's a little bit like describing all vegetables as vegetables. Yes, they are vegetables, but they've all got very different nutritional makeups. And pollen is very the same. It's the pollen from different flowers has different levels of nutrition. It has different defensive chemicals, and so they're not interchangeable. So I want to talk about parental care before we move on to anything else, because it is very, very tightly linked to nutrition, especially from the larval perspective, because we perhaps don't think of bees as sort of caring parents, but actually it's all a female ever does. She lays her eggs, and from day one she's gathering food for them, she's making sure the nest is safe, and so she is providing parental care in her own way. Now, there's a few different ways that bees can provision their offspring. The least common of these is what we call progressive provisioning. So it's the idea of the adult continually feeds the offspring through their development. And that way there's a feedback loop between the adult and the larva, and the adult can adjust the nutrients it provides. Now, this often happens in the highly social species. So the Western honeybee, for example, is a classic case of this. But it does happen in a few of our native species as well. So there's that little picture of a reed bee there. Some reed bees do progressively provision their offspring, and they provide little packets of pollen every now and then to raise their larvae throughout their lifetime. And so it's that way, if you think about it that way, there's a lot more interaction between the two of them, between the parent and the offspring, and they can adapt a little bit better to changing nutritional environments. But actually, the primary way that bees feed their offspring is through what we call mass provisioning. So this is simply the mother gathers all the food in one go, she plops an egg on it, and that's all the food the larva ever gets. And it's the default method, and most of our native bees practice this. In fact, even our social stingless bees practice mass provisioning despite being highly social. And so you can see here on the left, that's just a little egg that's plopped on top of a pile of pollen. And the little resin bee there, the golden brown resin bee, is a classic case of a bee that mass provisions. Now, the main difference between the progressive provisioning and the mass provisioning, and critically really, is the parent and the offspring never meet in the mass provisioning system. So it means that there's no room for feedback. The larva can't interact with the parent, and neither can the parent interact with the larva. So it's a very finite amount of food that they get. Now, as a brief aside, before we go on to sort of some of the experiments, I just wanted to address what we think about when bees go to flowers, because so as you can see, pollination versus nutrition. So it's quite easy to confuse those two things together and see a bee's job as, because we call them pollinators, right? And it can often give the impression that that is their job, or that's what they do. But pollination is incidental. It's not deliberate. So animals, all animals, and bees, of course, being one of those, they go to plants for food. They don't go to them to pollinate. From the plant's perspective, they have evolved physiology to make it very probable that a bee is going to collect pollen somewhere other than its pollen collecting areas, and hopefully deposit that pollen at a conspecific flower. But there's a lot of competition there, and there's a lot of conflict there. It's not, we call them mutualisms because they're mutually beneficial, and they are, but it's not a friendship. They often cheat each other, both the plant and the pollinators, and at any chance if they can get a one-up on each other, they will. Now, I also wanted to talk about bee declines. I mean, I'm sure a lot of you are aware of the talk around bee declines, and that we are losing our native bees, and not just here in Australia, but across the globe. And that's very true. But I wanted to sort of do a bit of debunking as well. So often in the media and the Australian media is just as guilty as this as anywhere else. When we talk about saving the bees, we see pictures of honeybees, and we see, oh, congratulations, more people are keeping honeybee hives, and it's not really helping. So honeybees aren't actually in danger. They're doing pretty well, actually. So that graph there shows the numbers of hives globally over the past, 50 years, 60 years. And you can see it's steadily climbing even now. So this was back in 2015. So this was slightly before some of the collapse disorder stuff came in, but again, it's not really resulted in decline overall. It's just sort of leveled it out. So in the idea of conserving honeybees is not really really important. And so supporting honeybees doesn't really support bee conservation. In fact, in many ways, it can hinder it. So here in Australia, for example, the Western honeybee is not a native, and it can actually damage native ecosystems quite badly through competing with local species, but also through proliferating alien plants and other weeds and things that are not necessarily very attractive to our native pollinators, but they really do. The honeybees really pick up on them. So it's important to know that the honeybee is a domesticated animal. Really, the idea of it being a wild, natural bee is a myth now. It's been bred for so many hundreds of years by us that it's far beyond what it would have been originally. And It's very, very important. I don't mean to imply that it hasn't got importance, but it's important in terms of an agricultural aspect. It's important economically, but we shouldn't confuse that with the conservation of bees more generally. So to talk about the conservation of bees more generally, this is a graph that just shows a little bit about what's happening in terms of bee species globally. So it's important to say that not all bee species are in decline. That like any groups of animals, there's always winners and losers, and some species are doing exceptionally well. But overall, the species richness of bees globally is declining. So that top graph there, this shows you the number of records that were recorded in the GBIF for bees across sort of a 100-year period, and as you can imagine, it's rising. As we get more technology, the world gets a smaller place. We get more records. But if you look at the bottom one, this is a record of species richness. So it's how many different species are being recorded each year, and that's not new species. That's just how many species of bee were recorded. And as you can see, once we get to about 1990, it really starts to decline. And so we're having more records, but we're having fewer species represented in those records. So it does show that overall we are losing our bee species diversity, and this is true for insect groups across the board. And in fact, the bees are not necessarily the worst affected of those. But you can imagine the impact that loss could have across a broader scale. So why is it happening? Well, $1 million question, I suppose. But it's not a simple problem, and it is a mix of various different, mainly, if I'm honest, anthropogenic reasons. But there are some others mixed in there too. So I put a few there. So pesticide exposure, habitat destruction. I mean, we're all aware of the amount of bushland that gets destroyed on a daily basis. Disease as well. I mean, we are living through a pandemic now. Animals are just as vulnerable to diseases in terms of their flare-ups. Climate change, of course, has changed a huge amount of factors for bees, and often this can be things such as when flowers flower, when plants bloom. When those things change and the bees and the plant become out of sync, it can really damage those systems, and of course it means that there's no food for bees. Alien species, and that can be plants or other alien bee species or other alien animal species. But all of these things combine together, and all of them are interlinked with nutritional degradation. So nutritional degradation is one of the primary threats to bee diversity globally. And I don't just mean that in terms of the loss of flora diversity, although that is very critical. We're also seeing evidence now that we are decreasing the nutritional quality of individual flower species. So there's been studies that have shown that the protein content of pollens has dropped significantly since the Industrial Revolution. So it shows that not only are we removing flowers in terms of the amount, we're removing the quality of them as well. So it's a double-edged sword. And so there is no smoking gun, is what I'm trying to say. It's a very complex ecological challenge, and it's something that we're still learning and understanding. I put a little picture there of the green carpenter bee because she is a classic case of how terrible it is, because this is one of Australia's most beautiful bees. It's the second largest in the country, well, in New South Wales anyway. And we're lucky enough to get them in northern Sydney, but they used to exist all through mid and southern New South Wales, right down through into Victoria, South Australia and Kangaroo Island. Now they only exist in one small population on Kangaroo Island and northern Sydney up to about Gosford, with a couple of small populations dispersed north of that. So that's a huge detraction in their natural range, and that's primarily due to habitat destruction. So the challenge. So bees face a massive challenge in modern times. It's hard enough to find the resources you need, but even more so now. And so they face a multifaceted challenge. So they have to find enough food for themselves and for their offspring. And they have to navigate a very varied nutritional environment. The pollens of different flowers vary hugely, and they need to be able to navigate through that complex environment. And so it raises quite important questions on how they do that, and whether where that understanding comes from. Are the adults being able to do it? Do the offspring do it? Is it a combination of the two? And so that's where my research sort of focuses. So I was interested in these questions sort of broadly. So how do bees regulate their nutrients? Can they do it? How do they do it? And so what nutrients do they regulate? And I used solitary bees because by being mass provisioned, it makes them very, very easy to manipulate in an experimental system. So this bee here is the only foreign bee you'll see today. So this is Osmia bicornis. It's a European mason bee. We don't get Osmia in Australia, but it's a megachilid. So it's very similar to our resin bees and our leafcutter bees in the way it forages and the way it provisions its larvae. And actually, we know almost nothing about larval nutrition in bees, really. Most of it comes from honeybees, and even then, it's few and far between. So, part one, the geometric framework and larval nutrition. So this was one of the major components of my PhD and formed the basis of my most recent paper. So, as I said, we used Osmia bicornis. It's a cavity nester, so it means that it nests in pre-existing cavities. It's the type of bee that you would get in your bee hotels if you have them. And there were two stages to the experimentation. So we looked at whether, when we gave larvae a choice, essentially, we gave them a fixed nutrient diet, and we also gave them two complementary ones. And then we also looked at whether there was any fat regulation in there as well. But I'm going to focus on point number one today, because that's the major component of the paper and actually showed the most interesting results as well. So I'm going to go through the geometric framework. Bear with me. It's not complicated. It's just it might be a little bit abstract, but I'll do it as clear as I can, and I hope that it comes across well. So essentially, what the geometric framework for nutrition is it's a way to represent on a graph what food an animal eats in terms of its ratio of nutrients and the amounts of nutrients contained within those foods as well. So if I put a spot on that graph there that represents a food, we can see what that has. It has a ratio of a 1:4 ratio of nutrient A to nutrient B. So for every one piece of nutrient A, there's 4 pieces of nutrient B. And similarly, if I put this one here, it's the other way around. So this has got a nutrient A to B ratio of 4:1. Right. So that graphical space, that white space between the axes, it represents nutrient space. Now, if I draw a line through one of those spots, if I move that spot anywhere along that line, it's the same ratio. So if I moved it right down towards the end, it would still be a nutrient ratio of nutrient A to B of 4:1. So what we can do with this quite simple representation is we can work out where within that nutrient space an animal aims to eat towards. How much does it consume, and what ratio of nutrients does it aim to consume as well. Pardon me. We call that the intake target. Now, most animals have an intake target. They aim for something when they're foraging. And if you use the rails that we've used before, those lines, essentially, if you've got 2 foods that exist on those 2 lines, you can eat those foods in different combinations to achieve any location between those 2 lines, essentially. So, for example, if we had 2 foods that represented these 2 lines, then an animal could combine those 2 foods together in order to reach that intake target in the middle. And so animals do that in the wild by foraging. That's exactly what animals do. They forage from different foods and they mix them together in order to achieve the key amount of nutrients that they require to maintain their bodies, to reproduce, etc. So if, for example, we had an animal and we had a food that was represented by this black rail here, and the animal had access to it, then all that animal has to do is consume that one food to a certain amount. So you can see nutrient A eaten, nutrient B eaten, and it'll achieve its intake target. Easy peasy, doesn't need to mix. But actually, that rarely happens. in nature. So most of the time, an animal either has to combine foods, or sometimes, in this situation, for example, where it's only got access to a single food, so it can't mix them together, but unfortunately, that food doesn't contain the right mix of nutrients for it to reach its intake target. So what animals do under those situations is they have to make a decision. They have to make a compromise, and we call those things rules of compromise. And what they do to compromise is interesting, because it tells us about what's important to them physiologically. Do they compromise on one nutrient or another? Do they compromise on neither? And that's a really interesting thing to learn, because it tells us a lot about what's important to them in terms of nutrition and in terms of what they forage for. So I'll put a couple of examples here. These graphs look a little bit scary, but they're very basic, really. All they're doing is demonstrating a hypothetical decision rule, as in a compromise. So each of these individual lines that you see running through here, they represent a food of a particular ratio of nutrients. And each animal in this hypothetical experiment only had access to one of those foods. So you can see, for example, in the first graph on the left-hand side there, all the animals have eaten to the level of nutrient A. So they've eaten enough food to achieve 10 of nutrient A, and that's their target. But if you look at B, they've eaten vastly over in some and vastly under in others. So it tells us that nutrient A is controlling that decision. Nutrient B is not important to the animal in terms of its regulation. And the middle one shows an example of where both nutrients are important. And so what the animal is doing is it's getting as geometrically close to that point in space it wants to be as it possibly can on the single food that it's got. And then on the far right-hand side, it shows that each of the nutrients are again involved in regulation, but actually it's about reaching whichever one you reach first. So those that reached their target for A first stopped and either under or overate B, and vice versa. So in my experiments, I wanted to look at what happened in bees, what happened in larval bees when we looked at things like decisions. And so we focused on the nutrients, in this particular case, on protein and carbohydrate. And that's primarily because we know they have a significant role in insect development. Protein is critical for growth, and carbohydrate is critical for energy storage as well. So we know they're important, and we know there's a history of those being important in other insect groups. So what we had to do was we had to create a series of essentially artificial pollen diets that we could strictly control the amount of nutrients that went in them, so we could vary them. And so we created three different protein to carbohydrate ratios. So we had a 1-to-1, so equal protein, equal carbohydrate, up to 1 part protein, 3 parts carbohydrate, so a bias towards carbohydrate. And actually, the little picture down on the bottom right corner there is some of those larvae on some of those artificial diets, and they all had to be manipulated by hand, which I can tell you was delicate at the best of times. But they are remarkably resilient, and they took to the diets really quite well. We also added another layer to it. So we had the 3 different ratios, but we also did concentrations as well. So essentially that represents placing a food further or up or further down one of those rails. So it's the same ratio, but there's less nutrients in one than there is in the other. And that would give us a little bit more space to work with. And what we did was we used essentially empty pollen to do that. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about pollen structure before we move on, because it'll help you understand why we did that. So we use a substance called sporopollenin, and sporopollenin forms the outer casing of pollen. And it's incredibly varied in its structure. It's complex, but interestingly, it's incredibly strong and incredibly tough. So it's been labeled the diamond of the plant world. In fact, we found sporopollenin in rocks that are over 500 million years old, and they're still chemically intact. So they're not fossilized, they are chemically intact even 500 million years later. So that shows you how incredibly strong this material is. And so, quite unsurprisingly, it's very, very resistant to being broken down in a digestive manner. But it also raises some interesting questions in terms of, well, how do you know what's inside? Because it's very difficult to get in. So all of the nutrients inside a pollen grain are locked inside this almost impenetrable surface. And the content varies massively. There can be huge swings in protein concentrations and lipid concentrations as well. So how do we know what's inside? in terms of how do the bees know what's inside? Well, honestly, we still don't really know. We still don't know whether bees are able to detect what's inside pollen grains accurately, or how they do that. And it's something that is still really important from a research perspective. And you can just see these are SEM images. So what they essentially show is what pollen looks like if you were able to see them at the micron scale. And if you're ever interested in seeing some incredible natural architecture, just put SEM pollen grains into Google, and they're absolutely incredible. So after that little bit of aside, that explains what we used the sporoplenin for and why we used it, because it's essentially a non-digestible component. So we can use that as a natural dilution to our diets. Now, the protein and the sugars that we used to make up the others were casein and trehalose, but we could have used many different types of proteins or sugars to achieve those ratios. We chose these because they had precedent, essentially, in diets previously. So this is the result of our no choice experiment. So what we did was we took these larvae and we gave them one of the 3 diets that we created, and they weren't allowed to feed on anything else. So what we were trying to do was we were trying to investigate what decisions they might make when they're on those fixed diets, because they can't chop and change, they can't mix with another food, they've only got what they've been given. So how do they navigate that? Do they not navigate it at all? Is it random? Or do they consume differentially depending on the nutrients they're aiming to achieve? Now, what we found, and actually quite against what we originally predicted, was they actually quite strictly controlled the amount of carbohydrate that they aim to consume and not the amount of protein. So the protein, you can see from that graph, the protein varies quite a lot, even if we take into account the difference in scale. And whereas the carbohydrate actually is really quite strictly controlled. And that's strange, because we would think from a growth perspective that they need that protein in order to grow, to develop, and to change into an adult. But actually they were accepting quite wild swings in the amount of protein, both under eating and overeating it as well. And so it does suggest that carbohydrate is playing a critical role in the decisions that these larvae are making about the nutrition they're consuming. Now, this graph is essentially a repeat of the one we've just looked at, but what it does is it applies a heat map. So this heat map represents weight. So it's the same data as the graph we've just seen, but the heat map in the background shows that actually, if you consume more carbohydrate, you become heavier. Now, you might ask, well, why does that matter? Cocoon weight in bees, or larval weight, is often used as a proxy for fitness. So particularly in females, larger females tend to have a better reproductive output, they tend to survive better. And so we often use body size as a proxy for how good or how the level of fitness that those individuals might achieve. And so you can see here that it's mediated quite strongly by the amount of carbohydrate that one consumes. Now, this is, again, it's a derivative of the data we've just looked at, but it helps to explain how consumption has been changing, cocoon weight has been changing across the diet ratios. So you can see here that if we look at the high concentration diets, so the ones where there was only 10% sporoplenin, so 10% dilution, you can see that those larvae that were raised on the low PC ratio, the low protein to carbohydrate ratio on the far right there, they achieved much greater weights than their brethren that were on the high protein to carbohydrate diets. Now, what is interesting is here you can see that when we look at the diluted diets, that pattern vanishes. Now, again, the natural question is, well, why might that be so? So what we discovered actually is that the bee larvae are not very good at dealing with dilution in their foods. And actually, from an evolutionary perspective, that's perhaps not that strange. Pollen is a very nutrient-dense foodstuff, and because all of their food is provided for by their parents, they, unlike many other larval insects like caterpillars who can deal very well with diluted nutrients, it appears that bee larvae really cannot. And so it masks a lot of the decisions and a lot of the changes that you might see just based on nutrient amount. And actually, you can see that a little bit clearer in this graph. So this shows how much of their provisions they actually consumed. So we know that the greatest cocoon weights were achieved on the diets that had the most carbohydrate in. And you can see here that the least amount of provision was consumed on the diets that had the most carbohydrate. So those bees that were on lower carbohydrate diets, they ate more. They ate more to try and make up for the fact that there wasn't enough carbohydrate in there. And that was true for both concentrations. So even though a lot of the effects in the lower concentrations were masked, you can see that the bees on their lower concentrations really did try and ramp up their consumption in order to make up for the fact there wasn't as much nutrients in there. So it's interesting because these are sedentary larvae. They don't move really. They have no contact with their parents. They've only got a finite amount of food, and yet they're clearly showing adaptations and changes depending on the food they're being given. Now, the second part of the experiment was looking at, well, okay, we've looked at what decisions they might make, and we've found out that they seem to regulate to a carbohydrate level. They seem to don't choose to eat to an amount of carbohydrate, and they accept a swing in protein. But are they able to mix foodstuffs together in order to try and achieve the intake target we discussed earlier, that perfect spot in nutrient space? So what we had is we had a group of larvae that were on different diet pairings. So the diet pairings are represented in red there, and all the letters mean they just indicate different diets. So a number 1 indicates a higher concentration of the diet, a 2 indicates a lower concentration, an A indicates a high protein to carbohydrate ratio, and C indicates a low one. So basically those on C have got more carbohydrate there. And this is the sort of pattern we'd expect to see if it was just random. So if the pairs just ate between the foods randomly, then what would they look like? And you'd expect to see this sort of diamond shape here with them sort of nestling along the edges. Now, this is, again, that same random consumption map. So these are what we would expect if they ate randomly from the food they were given. But this is what we actually saw. So the black points here dictate what they did eat. Now, it's worth saying here that I mentioned that the larvae don't move. So you might be thinking, well, how can they choose between different foodstuffs? So what we actually did was they were allowed to feed from one food for 2 days. Then we swapped it out and gave them the other one for 2 days and then back again. So rather than being able to choose between 2 at the same time, they had to differentially eat between them over time instead. Now, this is not a beautiful, clear picture, unfortunately, but it does show there's something going on here. So they're not eating randomly. You can see there's a deviation from that red line, and it suggests that there is some form of regulation happening here. And because it differs from random, it tells us that the bees are making those decisions. Now, what we would have loved to have seen was something like this. So this would have, you can see those 4 black dots there, all clustered in one space, and that would tell us, it's a really good idea of where their intake target is. And it shows that although they've been given different foods, they've eaten them in different amounts in order to converge on the same space. And that's what we really, that's the beautiful thing to see if you can. And we didn't see that, but we did see that they deviated from random. And actually, if you look at this graph here, this shows this a little bit perhaps more clearly. So on the left-hand side of your screen, this is what it would have looked like if you ate randomly, whether you started on diet A or whether you started on diet C. So you can see it's got this sort of spiky look to it in the sense that essentially both protein and carbohydrate vary with the amount of protein and carbohydrate in the food. There's no control being put in place by the larva. But actually on the right-hand side shows what they actually did. So you can see in blue there that the carbohydrate is actually quite well controlled, and it's nowhere near the spiky image that you see when it's random. However, protein is almost a mirror image of random. So it suggests that even when given a choice, they do not seem to regulate based on protein. They seem to choose to eat to carbohydrate levels and ignore either overeating or undereating their protein. So just as a quick summary of that, what we've shown is that the larvae have demonstrated a capacity to regulate their nutrient intake, despite the fact that they are completely sedentary, that they make no connection with their parents, and they're only given a finite amount of food. What we've also shown is that when they are restricted to a particular type of food that's only got one ratio of nutrients in it, that they will consume to a level of carbohydrate. They'll aim for a carbohydrate and they'll happily over or undereat the amount of protein. And we've also shown that when they get given a choice, although they don't converge, or at least they didn't converge in this particular experiment, doesn't mean that they don't converge in reality. They did converge along a line, which suggests they are aiming for a ratio at least, if not an amount. But I think the most critical thing here, and it's the thing I really want to highlight, is this is quite literally the opposite of what we see in honeybee larvae. So in honeybee larvae, survival is mitigated by higher protein and lower carbohydrate amounts. So they aim for high protein, lower carbohydrate. This is the complete opposite. So these bee larvae aimed for higher amounts of carbohydrate relatively. They consume to a level of carbohydrate. Now, that was a surprise to me, and it's a surprise to all of us who worked on the experiment at the time. But I think what it really highlights is we are very guilty of using research and data from honeybees and applying it blanketly to all bees. And this shows that that is not only wrong, it's utterly inaccurate in most cases. So what does it tell us? It tells us that different bee species make different nutritional decisions. So it means that we can't just blanketly apply a single rule to all the bee species that we have. I mean, we have thousands of bee species just in Australia. So to apply a blanket rule of how they forage or the decisions they make is just bad. But why might decisions differ? I mean, why does a honeybee larva seem to make different decisions to a solitary bee larva in this case? Well, bees' ecologies vary dramatically across the globe, but also even within the same biomes. So in the case of Osmia bicornis, which was the mason bee that I worked on, all of the larvae become reproductives, unlike honeybees. And all of the larvae have to go through a period of diapause, which is similar to hibernation. They essentially wait out the winter as an adult, and they have to wait in Europe, which can be, maybe 4 or 5, 6 months of colder weather. And they have to survive that period in order to hatch out the other end. So they may actually be eating to carbohydrate level because they need to store as much in their bodies as they can to make it through that period. It doesn't matter if you grow up really well. If you don't make it through diapause, you'll never breed. So that shows, and that can apply to a lot of our bees here in Australia, because we have a lot of bees that overwinter. And so that may strongly dictate the nutritional decisions that both the parents and the offspring make. They could also be quite reliant, excuse me, on their mother. So actually, perhaps the larvae regulate to a carbohydrate level, but actually they just don't possess the ability to regulate to a protein level. It's not that it's not important, they just don't have that ability. And perhaps they rely on their mother to get that right for them. Equally, perhaps they, rather than regulate protein via how much they consume, perhaps they regulate it internally. So perhaps they decrease or increase the absorption of protein depending on how much they have in their diet. But essentially, we really don't know, and so it's something that has opened the door to a lot more questions. But I think, to be honest, most research does that anyway. So we know that pollen protein, in particular in plants, actually varies dramatically. So if larvae are relying on their mother to know best, then we really need to understand whether mother really does know best, because at the moment we really don't know. It definitely highlights the complexity between parent and offspring in this situation, what the parent is giving the offspring and what the offspring is doing with what it's given. And it just highlights of how little we really know about bee nutrition, and yet we know it's so important to their survival and to their conservation. So what might it mean sort of more broadly? So I suppose, as I mentioned, one of the critical things is we need to be really careful about using common experimental species like the honeybee as proxies for our native bees, because they often differ massively in their ecologies and how they behave. And so we could actually be doing more damage by applying that broad brush approach than to actually studying more small groups. It also tells us that the damage that's caused by nutritional degradation across the environment might vary quite dramatically depending on the species. Because if you are more affected by one nutrient than another, and we're losing more flowers that contain that nutrient, then we're going to have differential effects on the population. And that's important because that highlights conservation priorities in terms of bees. And it also shows us that it really is critical that adult bees are able to get access to a broad enough suite of nutritional resources to provide for their offspring. Because although the offspring do have an ability to regulate, we've shown that actually it's not perfect. There are limitations to that. And so because we still understand so little about how parents can assess the quality of the pollen that they're gathering from their offspring, and we know that we are reducing the floral diversity in our environment, and we're also reducing the quality of those floral resources as well, then we could be leading our bees into what I term here a nutritional trap, as in the idea of they're foraging off of things that actually they're not aware of in terms of their quality, and that quality is reducing without them knowing it. So what they provided for their offspring 60 years ago is no longer good enough for them today. And that's quite a scary thought, I think. So this is the final part, and we'll be wrapping up soon. You'll be glad to hear, I'm sure. But I wanted to just do a little bit about sort of what it means for looking after bees, and that it's not all not all doom and gloom. This is the picture there actually is of me doing some of my field work on my PhD. I got the opportunity to go to a lot of really beautiful organic farms, and actually a lot of the technologies and initiatives that are set up on farmlands we can actually apply in smaller scale to our own homes as well. So, nutritional resources. Diversity is key. It really is. I mentioned that we don't know a great deal about the nutritional makeup of pollen, and that's in fact even more true here in Australia. There is higher amounts of research and knowledge in places like Europe and America about this, but actually, a lot of our native flowers in particular, we really don't know anything about them, nutritionally speaking, in relation to bees. What are their pollens like? What do they contain? Are they high in protein? Do they have protective compounds in them? We really don't know a lot of this information at all. And so, with a lack of that knowledge, what we can do is provide a diverse floral resource, because if we diversify what we provide and we look after as many of our native plants as we can, we're going to capture as much of that nutritional quality as possible as well. So diversity is twofold. I've just noticed I spelled diversity wrong. Apologies. But essentially, it's got two aspects to it. So you've got pollen and nectar providing flowers, and they're not necessarily the same thing. So we have some flowers that provide a huge amount of nectar, and some that provide a huge amount of pollen. Not all of them provide both, and so making sure you've got a mix of those is really useful. But also, and I think the one that most people forget and that often slips under the radar is temporal diversity. So I get to go to lots of gardens in my job, and I've also been to lots of farms and wild meadows and those types of things. And if you go in spring and summer, it's like paradise. It's beautiful. There's flowers everywhere. There's insects all over. But often you can go back to those areas in autumn and winter and find that they're actually quite barren and there's not a lot in flower. So making sure that you've got things that flower throughout the year to provide that nutrition across the year is really important. Most of our bee activity in New South Wales does happen in spring, summer and early autumn. So that's when you are going to get the most of your bees, right? But there are quite a few species that do have activity periods over winter. So many of you here probably keep stingless bees. Although they're very quiet over winter, they do forage when the weather is warm enough. And so having pollen sources and nectar sources is actually really good for them across the winter. But it's also not just about doing something different. So it's not necessarily about having to think, right, I've got to go out and buy loads of flowers and put them in. Sometimes it's about looking after what we already have. So here I'm talking perhaps a little bit less about our gardens and perhaps a little bit more about our bushland areas, but also our fringe areas, sort of the edges of parks and verges and things like that can actually provide a wealth of resources for pollinators and bees in particular. So this is a photograph from one of the farms that I visited, and it doesn't look particularly attractive. You know, it's not splashed in colour. It looks a little bit rough, but actually this site had a really high diversity of bees because it had a mix of low cover flowers and plants that ran through that thicker grass area that has been left and is only mowed, you know, on a very sort of broad schedule. And it also had a very mature hedgerow that wasn't trimmed to look pretty. It was very diverse, had lots of mixes of different plants in there, and it was allowed to do its own thing. And that actually provided not only food resources, but also shelter and nesting materials for the pollinators as well. So these are the sort of initiatives that we can think about applying to things like our parks and our roadside verges as well. So essentially, it doesn't always have to be pretty, although I'm sure we'd all like it to be. So a little bit about planting. It's not as complicated as you think. I think people always ask me, oh, what flowers are good for bees? And really, it's hard to get that wrong, to be honest. Any plant that you plant within reason will have a value. But these are just some of the groups that do get a lot of attention from our native bees. So if you look at Myrtaceae, you've got lily pleas and the tea trees. I really like the tea trees because they always provide a really nice glut of flowers, and they're always smothered in native bees. And then you've got things like your Banksias and your Grevilleas. Especially in the Banksias, we have got a few winter flowering species as well, which is really useful and gives you a nice sort of top up in those winter months. Asteraceae, huge plant group, but my favourites from Asteraceae are actually daisies. So we've got lots of native daisies, and the good thing about them is they're really pretty. And also they've got varying flowering periods, so you can get daisies that flower throughout the year, and you can really have a beautiful patch of colour throughout that time. And then Fabaceae, the peas especially. So this is one of my favourites is the bush pea. So they often have, at least in terms of their respective group, the peas themselves, have quite high quality pollen in terms of protein content, and so they're always a really good one to have, and they're beautiful to look at, so it's a win-win. Now, exotics. So as a rule, I would always say go for your natives first, because your native pollinators have evolved alongside them for millions of years. They have an intrinsic understanding, and they naturally support each other. And the great thing about that is that you're not only, by planting natives, you're not only supporting the native plants, you're supporting native pollinators as well. But having said that, not all exotics are bad in terms of what they can do for bees. But it can be a little bit of a difficult sort of minefield to navigate. So these three photographs here, I've included these because some of you might recognise what flower they're on. So they're on cassia, which is quite a renowned weed. Now, this is actually at our nursery site in Ku-ring-gai, where I keep a lot of the stingless beehives. And you can see the top there, that's the green carpenter's bee, the rare species that I mentioned earlier. And we have we're lucky enough in Ku-ring-gai to have a few small isolated populations of this bee. And when you spot one, it's really quite magical. But you can also see a little reed bee on the bottom there with a little yellow stripe on her face, sorry. And of course, our little Tetracondylar carbonaria there. Now, this was all taken on the same day, and these are just 3 species, but I saw at least 6, all natives, foraging off of this cassia. And there were no other flowers in the area in flower at that time that were attracting this level of attention. So you can understand why that can be a bit difficult, because it's, cassia is quite a prolific weed. It'd be really great to get rid of a lot of it, but it's also the idea of thinking, well, it's also providing quite an important resource for our native bees as well. So it does become quite difficult to make that decision. And what I would say is, with that type of thing, is If you do want to remove something like that, then think about what you're going to replace it with. And if you can replace it with something that's going to flower in the same period, that'd be great. Or a case of thinking, well, maybe I won't remove it, but maybe I need to think about limiting how it spreads. So in terms of your exotics, herbs are really good. Herbs are a great one. They're always really popular with bees, and most of them you can keep under pretty tight control as well. In fact, a lot of your veggies, if you let them go over and go to flower, they can be really useful too. And again, when we're looking at others, daisies are another great one. They really do have got a lot of bang for their buck, daisies. But again, there are plenty of natives. So if you can get hold of the native ones, then do. And I've got salvia on there. I'm sure many of you have got salvia in your garden, and you'll know how popular it is with the native bees. This is the final thing I want to mention, and it's a little bit more about planning your garden as opposed to necessarily what to plant in it. So bees forage in a way where they are attracted to large banks of flowers. So they don't like to have to search within a sea of different flowers, different flower species. They like to go to one big group and do the foraging, and then go, pardon me, to another big group and do it. So if you're planting for bees, you're planting for pollinators, think about clumping your flowers in those groups, because it'll actually help the bees. It'll help make them more efficient and more attractive to them. And you can also let certain plants go to seed. So got a colleague who has a lot of coriander in his back garden. He often lets that go to seed, and almost every year, all of the stems are covered in golden nomia bees, males, because a lot of the males don't have a nest or a home to go to, so they look for these little dead stalks to roost on. So you can keep those in as well, and although they're not providing a food resource, they are still providing something important to looking after your bees. So that's everything that I wanted to go through today. I hope you found it interesting and that you learned a little bit more about native bees and their nutrition. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have, and I'll do my best. I can't promise I'll know, but I'll certainly try my best.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions?
Can we go to the view of everybody?
Hang on.
Yes, I will stop sharing.
Let's see. Yep.
I have a question on your research. What's next? What's next for that larvae research?
Oh, well, I suppose, I mean, sky's the limit, really. So for me, I'm very interested in filling in what I see as the obvious missing link in there, and that's understanding what the parents do. So we've looked at how the larvae regulate their nutrition. What we don't know is whether the parent regulates the nutrition for the larva as well. So do they forage differentially off different flowers in order to essentially provide a certain macronutrient or even micronutrient ratio for them? And it also opens up another interesting avenue in the terms of, is there a conflict between what the larva thinks is best for itself and what the parent thinks is best? So we know that, you know, parent offspring conflict is prevalent in birds, for example, and there's lots of evolutionary reasons as to why that might be the case in bees as well. There are a number of bee species where the parents deliberately malnourish some of their offspring in order to force them to stay in the nest and look after their siblings. So as you can imagine, from the offspring's perspective, that is not evolutionary speaking anyway what it's after. You know, it's essentially being robbed of its opportunity to reproduce. So there is a conflict in other systems, and it will be interesting to see if that conflict is also present in this one.
Do you have, okay, you listed the various types of groups, flowers, species that we could plant in our gardens. Do you have like a worksheet with a list of that? Like, I realize it's in the, or could you send us the I can't think of the word.
Presentation?
PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Presentation.
Yeah, sure. So there's actually lots of really good lists out there. It's just knowing where to look. So one of the best ones actually available is a list by Megan Howcroft of Bee Business. So she's a native bee researcher here in Australia, and she does excellent resources, both in terms of how to plant for bees, but also identification guides and that sort of thing. I've got a copy of that I can send over, and it's a great way to get a good idea of what you can plant.
Cool, thank you. Do we have any more questions, any more curiosities?
I think I just might say, well, thank you very much. Lots of lovely info, and it looks as if you and I have both studied in God's own county.
Yes, very much.
And for anyone else who doesn't know what we're talking about Yorkshire.
Yes, it's if any of you get a chance to go, but ignore London. No one cares. Go to Yorkshire. It's for tourism. It's a really beautiful part of England. I really enjoyed my time there.
All right. Well, yep. Thank you very much, Dr. Austin, for that, and yeah, for showing us about, I guess, the bees and the kind of research that goes on regarding them. So, and also giving us an idea of what we can help, how we can help native bee species without necessarily having our own hive in our backyard or in our courtyard, as the case may go. So,
No problem. Happy to be here.
Yeah.
That was really great. Really enjoyed that.
So general PSN news, obviously we are not doing anything in person. However, I think that we are trying to organise some Zoom meetings for people to socialise with. We've got supper coming up now. So where I think someone, it might very well have to be me, will sort people into rooms sort of to have small chats with, you know, the opportunity to talk to other people without 25 people trying to talk all at once. Hopefully, we'll see how that goes.